Well, good morning, everyone. I'm at the Bentonville battlefield near Bentonville, North Carolina. And this was the site of one of the last major battles of the Civil War. The Battle of Bentonville was fought here on March 19th through the 21st of 1865, and it was the largest Civil War battle fought in the state of North Carolina. It was fought in the waning days of the Civil War, just a couple weeks really before General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. And here on this battlefield, Union troops under the command of General William Tecumseh Sherman fought Confederate troops under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston. To the right of this storyboard is the Goldsboro Rifles Monument. It was placed here in 1895. And when the monument was placed here, Confederate General Wade Hampton delivered the keynote address. The inscription on this Goldsboro Rifles Monument is quite interesting. 23 of those buried here had their last hours soothed by the loving care of John Harper and his noble wife, Amy. And the Harper house is visible in the distance. It's the White House just on the other side of the Visitor Center. The Harper House, like a number of private residences and buildings during the Civil War, was used as a hospital. And those that sadly didn't make it are buried here in this small cemetery on the battlefield. As you can see on the monuments, this is the final resting place of several unknown Confederate soldiers who died in the battle and was buried here in this small cemetery. And right next to the Confederate cemetery, we find the Harper family cemetery. The Harper family lived here, and their land was the site of the battle that was fought here in the closing days of the Civil War. Here are the graves of John and Amy Harper. I read somewhere where they continued to live here after the war and operate their farm. John died in 1897, and Amy died 3 years later in 1900. And their children and some of their descendants are buried here. Some of them have marked stones, and other graves are marked with this small white field stones. I don't know what the story is with those, but I guess it may be the footstones for the grave, because this one is at the grave of John Harper. So I guess they're footstones. They're not unmarked graves. A large part of the battle was fought here in these open fields. None of these houses or buildings were here at the time of the battle. And the Union and Confederate troops met here. And over 3 days it resulted in a Union victory.
This storyboard, located near the Harper House, gives you a little bit of information on the battle that occurred here. And it also gives you some information on the Harper family who lived here before, during, and after the Civil War.
John and Amy Harper lived in this house during the Civil War and the Battle of Bentonville. The Harpers were described as upper middle class and well-respected citizens of the community. John was active in the courts as a justice and in the school system, and they lived here most of their lives. And as we covered a few minutes ago on their gravestones, they're buried just a few hundred yards away from here. And he died in 1897 and Amy died in 1900. And the house is original to the property, which I was glad to find out. Many of these houses have fallen into disrepair, and some were even burned by the troops on their way out of town after the battle. But this is the Harper house, and it's original to the property. As I said earlier, this house during the battle was used as a field hospital, and one of the exhibits inside the visitor center said as many as 40 soldiers at one time was being treated in the rooms inside this house. Just a few yards from the main house, is the well where the family got their water, in this building, which appears to be the kitchen. Fire was a threat back in those days, and the kitchen was often in a separate building a short distance from the house, and the meals were prepared here and then carried across the yard to the dining room in the main house. This small building, while not original to the property, represents the house where the enslaved people lived. And the Harpers were slaveholders, and they housed their enslaved workers in a building much like this. While I was at the Harper House, I noticed this stone marker in the middle of a pasture field just to the south of the house, and decided to walk out here and see what it was all about. And I find that it appears to be the grave of a man named S.I. Thornton, who was born on April 17th, 1828 and died on May 30th, 1912. I'll have to do some research to figure out who Mr. Thornton was, but his epitaph reads, "An honest man is the noblest work of God."
Before leaving the battlefield, I stopped back by the visitor center and asked one of the volunteers about Mr. Thornton. She told me that several years after the war, Mr. Thornton bought the Harper House. He loved the place, and in his later years, he could be found sitting on the front porch enjoying the view of his pasture field. His last request was to be buried in the pasture field just a few yards from his home.
It was a pretty good walk across the battlefield till we get here to this storyboard that explains the movements and thinking of Confederate General Joseph Johnston. Just a short distance down the brick walkway is a statue of General Johnston. It stands as a memorial to the general and to those who died in battle here and are buried in the Confederate cemetery. After the battle was over, the armies under the command of General Sherman and General Johnston kind of retreated in the same direction. They both headed north toward Smithfield, and General Johnston was joined there by General Wade Hampton, and they camped just south of the river in Smithfield. And Johnston sent several telegraphs off to General Lee, who was engaged in his own flight between Petersburg and Appomattox Courthouse. General Sherman, on the other hand, he set up his command post at the old Johnson County Courthouse. He pretty much stayed there until the evening of April 12th, 1865, when he received a dispatch from General Grant informing him that General Lee had surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. Over the next several days, General Sherman sent out several dispatches to General Johnston, and finally, about April 25th, 26th, the two generals met near Durham, North Carolina. And over a period of several days, they discussed the terms of surrender. The first terms of surrender, agreed to by General Sherman and General Johnston, were rejected by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And the terms were renegotiated over a period of a couple more days. And the final terms were basically along the same lines as those agreed to by General Grant and General Lee at Appomattox. General Joseph Johnston surrendered more than 80,000 Confederate troops, which was the largest surrender of the Civil War. It was about 3 or 4 times more than the number of troops that General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Now it's a little bit odd that after the war, General Johnston and General Sherman became good friends, and they would often visit one another when Sherman was in Washington, and General Johnston, I believe, lived in Baltimore, and they would often visit one another. And when General Sherman died and his funeral was held in New York City, it was a cold and rainy day in New York, and General Johnston attended, and I believe he was one of the honorary pallbearers. And the funeral route was several miles long, and General Johnston marched the whole route bareheaded. He said something to the effect that if it was me, General Sherman would be doing the same thing. Ironically, just a few weeks after the funeral of General Sherman, General Johnston caught pneumonia and passed away, and he's buried in Baltimore, Maryland. One of the strange stories of the Civil War. Enemies on the battlefield, but in real life, they became close and good friends.
Well, it's about time to wrap this up. I hope you've enjoyed my visit to the Bentonville Battlefield State Historical Park. If you have, I'd appreciate a thumbs up below. And if you want to keep up with my future adventures, be sure to ring that bell and subscribe. For now, it's time for me to head on down the road and see what's around the bend. Until next time, let's all enjoy life's journey. I'll see you down the road. So long, everybody.